The Sinking of the Titanic and Other Great Sea Disasters, edited by Logan Marshall. Chapter 19. How the World Received the News. Nations prostrate with grief. Messages from kings and cardinals. Disaster stirs world to necessity of stricter regulations. Young and old, rich and poor were prostrated by the news of the disaster. Even Wall Street was neglected. Nor was the grief confined to America. European nations felt the horror of the calamity and sent expressions of sympathy. President Taft made public cablegrams received from the King and Queen of England and the King of Belgium, conveying their sympathy to the American people and the sorrows which have followed the Titanic disaster. The President's responses to both messages were also made public. The following was the cablegram from King George, dated at Sandringham. The Queen and I are anxious to assure you and the American nation of the great sorrow which we experienced at the terrible loss of life that has occurred among the American citizens, as well as among my own subjects, by the foundering of the Titanic. Our two countries are so intimately allied by ties of friendship and brotherhood that any misfortunes which affect the one must necessarily affect the other, and on the present terrible occasion they are both equally sufferers. George R. and I. President Taft's reply was as follows. In the presence of the appalling disaster to the Titanic, the people of the two countries are brought into community of grief through their common bereavement. The American people share in the sorrow of their kinsmen beyond the sea. On behalf of my countrymen, I thank you for your sympathetic message. William H. Taft. The message from King Albert of Belgium was as follows. I beg your Excellency to accept my deepest condolences on the occasion of the frightful catastrophe to the Titanic, which has caused such mourning in the American nation. The President's acknowledgment follows. I deeply appreciate your sympathy with my fellow countrymen who have been stricken with affliction through the disaster to the Titanic. Message from Spain. King Alfonso and Queen Victoria sent the following cablegram to President Taft. We have learned with profound grief of the catastrophe to the Titanic, which has plunged the American nation in mourning. We send you our sincerest condolence and wish to assure you and your nation of the sentiments of friendship and sympathy we feel toward you. A similar telegram was sent to the King of England. The many expressions of grief to reach President Taft included one signed jointly by the three American cardinals who were in New York attending the meeting of the trustees of the Catholic University. It said, To the President of the United States. The archbishops of the country, in joint session with the trustees of the Catholic University of America, beg to offer to the President of the United States their expression of their profound grief at the awful loss of human lives attendant upon the sinking of the steamship Titanic, and at the same time to assure the relatives of the victims of this horrible disaster of our deepest sympathy and condolence. They wish also to attest hereby to the hope that the lawmakers of the country will see in this sad accident the obvious necessity of legal provisions for greater security of ocean travel. James Cardinal Gibbons, Archbishop of Baltimore. John Cardinal Farley, Archbishop of New York. William Cardinal O'Connell, Archbishop of Boston. House adjourned. Formal tribute to the Titanic's dead was paid by the House of Representatives when it adjourned for 24 hours. The prayer of the Reverend Henry N. Cooden in opening the House session was, in part, We thank thee that though in the ordinary circumstances of life selfishness and greed seem to be in the ascendancy, yet in times of distress and peril, then it is that the nobility of soul, the godlike in man, asserts itself and makes heroes. The flags on the White House and other government buildings throughout the country were at half-staff. Rome mourned Major Butt. A special telegram from Rome stated that one of the victims most regretted was Major Butt, whose jovial, bright character made many friends there. Besides autographed letters from the Pope and Cardinal Merry del Val to President Taft, the Major had with him a signed photograph of the pontiff, given by him personally. Cardinal Merry del Val had several conversations with Major Butt, who declared that the Cardinal was the first gentleman of Europe. Shortly before he was leaving Rome, regretting that he had not signed a picture of Cardinal Merry del Val, Major Butt entrusted a friend to ask for one. The Cardinal willingly put an autograph dedication on a picture, recalling their pleasant intercourse. London newspapers condemned laxity of law. British indignation, which is not easily excited, was aroused over knowledge that an antiquated law enables steamship companies to fail to provide sufficient lifeboats to accommodate the passengers and crew of the largest liners in the event of such a disaster as that which occurred to the Titanic. It will be insisted that there be an investigation of the loss of life in the Titanic, and that the shortage of boats be gone into thoroughly. The newspapers commented adversely on the lack of boats, and their views were emphasized by the knowledge that no attempt has been made to change the regulations in the face of the fact that the inadequacy of boats in such an emergency was called to the attention of Parliament at the time of the collision between the White Star liner Olympic and the cruiser Hawke. It was pointed out at this time that German vessels, much smaller in size than the Olympic, carried more boats, and also that these boats were of greater capacity. T.W. Moore, secretary of the Merchant Service Guild, when seen at the Guild's room in Liverpool, said, "The Titanic disaster is an example, on a colossal scale, of the pernicious and supine system of officials as represented by the Board of Trade. Modern liners are so designed that they have no accommodations for more lifeboats. Among practical seamen, it has long been recognized that the modern passenger ship has nothing like adequate boat capacity. The Board of Trade has its own views, and the ship owners also have their views, which are largely based upon the economical factor. The naval architects have their opinions, but the practical merchant seaman is not consulted. The Titanic disaster is a complete substantiation of the agitation that our guild has carried on for nearly 20 years against the scheme that has precluded practical seamen from being consulted with regard to boat capacity and life-saving appliances." House of Commons investigation. Immediate and searching inquiry into the Titanic disaster was promised on the floor of the House of Commons April 18th by President Sidney Buxton of the Board of Trade, which controls all seagoing vessels. Buxton, in discussing the utterly inadequate life-saving equipment of the big liner, declared that the committee of the board in charge of life-saving precautions had recently recommended increased lifeboats, rafts, and life preservers on all big ships, but that the requirements had been found unsatisfactory and had not been put in force. He frankly admitted the necessity for increased equipment without delay. The board, he said, was utterly unable to compel the transatlantic vessels to reduce their speed in the contest for express train ships. He also said the board could not force ships to take the southerly passage in the spring to avoid ice. The regulations under which the Titanic carried lifeboat accommodations for only about 1/3 of her passengers and crew had not been revised by the committee since 1894. At that time, the regulations were made for ships of 10,000 tons or more. The Titanic's tonnage was 45,000, for which the present requirements are altogether insufficient. Work of raising relief funds prompt. Several foreign governments telegraphed to the British government messages of condolence for the sufferers. The King sent a donation of $2,625 to the Mansion House Fund. Queen Mary donated $1,310, and Queen Alexandra $1,000 to the same fund. Oscar Hammerstein proffered, and the Lord Mayor accepted, the use of his opera house for an entertainment in aid of the fund. The Shipping Federation donated $10,500 to the mayor of Southampton's fund, taking care to explain that the White Star Line was not affiliated with the Federation. Some public institutions also offered to take care of the orphaned children of the crew. Large firms contributed liberally to the various relief funds, while Covent Garden and other leading theaters prepared special performances to aid in the relief work. Indignant Germany demands reforms. All Germany, as well as England, was stunned and grieved by the magnitude of the horror of the Titanic catastrophe. Anglo-German recriminations for the moment ceased as far as the fatherland was concerned, and profound and sincere compassion for the nation on whom the blow had fallen more heavily was the supreme note of the hour. The Kaiser, with its characteristic promptitude, was one of the first to communicate his sympathy by telegraph to King George and to the White Star Line. Admiral Prince Henry of Prussia did likewise, and the first act of the Reichstag, after reassembling on Tuesday, was to pass a standing vote of condolence with the British people in their distress. German laws also inadequate. The German laws governing the safety appliances on board transoceanic vessels seem to be as archaic and inadequate as those of the British Board of Trade. The maximum provision contained in the German statutes refers to vessels with the capacity of 50,000 cubic meters, which must carry 16 lifeboats. The law also says that if this number of lifeboats be insufficient to accommodate all the persons on board, including the crew, there shall be carried elsewhere in the vessel a correspondingly additional number of collapsible lifeboats, suitable rafts, floating deck chairs and lifebuoys, as well as generous supplies of lifebelts. A vessel of 10,000 tons was a leviathan in the days when the German law was passed, and it appears to have undergone no change to meet the conditions imposed by the construction of vessels twice or three times 10,000 tons, like the Hamburg American Kaiserin August Victoria or the North German Lloyd George Washington, to say nothing of the 50,000-ton Imperator, which is to be added to the Hamburg fleet next year. The German lines seem, like the White Star Company, to have reckoned simply with the practical impossibility of a ship like the Titanic succumbing to the elements. Personal anxiety. Although Germany's and Berlin's direct interest in the passengers aboard the Titanic was less than that of London, New York, or Paris, there was the utmost concern for their fate. Ambassador Leishman and other members of the American Embassy were particularly interested in hearing about Major Archie Butt, who passed through Berlin less than a month before the disaster, en route from Russia and the Far East. Vice President John B. Thayer and family of Philadelphia were also in Berlin a fortnight ago, and were guests of the American Consul General and Mrs. Thackeray. A score of other lesser-known passengers had recently stayed in Berlin hotels, and it was local friends or kinsmen of theirs who were in a state of distressing unrest over their fate. Their anxiety was aggravated by the old fogey methods of the German newspapers, which are invariably 12 or 15 hours later than journals elsewhere in Europe on world news events. Although New York, London, and Paris had the cruel truth with their morning papers on Tuesday, it was not until the middle of the forenoon that extras made the facts public in Berlin. William T. Stead was well and favorably known in Germany, and his fate was keenly and particularly mourned. Germans have also noted that many Americans of direct Teutonic ancestry or origin were among the shining marks in the death list. Colonel John Jacob Astor is claimed as of German extraction, as well as Isidor Straus, Benjamin Guggenheim, Washington Roebling, and Henry B. Harris. All of them had been in Germany frequently and had a wide circle of friends and acquaintances. Only one well-known resident of Berlin was aboard the Titanic, Frau Antoinette Flegenheim, whose name appears among the rescued. Chapter 21. Searching for the Dead. Sending out the Mackay, Bennett, and Menia, Bremen passengers see bodies, identifying bodies, confusion in names, recoveries. A few days after the disaster, the cable steamer Mackay Bennett was sent out by the White Star Line to cruise in the vicinity of the disaster and search for missing bodies. 2 wireless messages addressed to J. Bruce Ismay, president of the International Mercantile Marine Company, were received on April 21st at the offices of the White Star Line from the cable ship Mackay Bennett via Cape Race, one of which reported that the steamship Rhine had sighted bodies near the scene of the Titanic wreck. The first message, which was dated April 20th, read, "Steamer Rhine reports passing wreckage and bodies 42.1 north, 49.13 west, 8 miles west of 3 big icebergs. Now making for that position. Expect to arrive 8 o'clock tonight. Signed, Mackay Bennett." The second message read, "Received further information from Bremen, presumably steamship Bremen, and arrived on ground at 8 o'clock p.m. Start on operation tomorrow. Have been considerably delayed on passage by dense fog. Signed, Mackay Bennett." After receiving these messages, Mr. Ismay issued the following statement. "The cable ship Mackay Bennett has been chartered by the White Star Line in order to proceed to the scene of the disaster and do all she could to recover the bodies and glean all information possible. Every effort will be made to identify bodies recovered, and any news will be sent through immediately by wireless. In addition to any such messages as these, the Mackay Bennett will make a report of its activities each morning by wireless, and such reports will be made public at the offices of the White Star Line. The cable ship has orders to remain on the scene of the wreck for at least a week, but should a large number of bodies be recovered before that time, she will return to Halifax with them. The search for bodies will not be abandoned until not a vestige of hope remains for any more recoveries. The Mackay Bennett will not make any soundings, as they would not serve any useful purpose, because the depth where the Titanic sank is more than 2,000 fathoms." On April 22nd, the first list of 27 names of bodies recovered was made public. It contained that of Frederick Sutton, a well-known member of the Union League of Philadelphia. It did not contain the name of any other prominent man who perished, although it was thought that the name George D. Wyden might refer to George D. Widener, son of P.A.B. Widener of Philadelphia. The original passenger lists of the Titanic did not mention Wyden, which apparently established the identity of the body as that of Mr. Widener, who, together with his son, Harry, was lost. The wireless message, after listing the names, concluded, "All preserved," presumably referring to the condition of the bodies. A number of the names in the list did not check up with the Titanic's passenger list, which led to the belief that a number of the bodies recovered were members of the Titanic's crew. Minia sent to assist. At noon, April 23rd, there was posted on the bulletin in the White Star office this message from the Mackay Bennett, dated Sunday, April 21st. Latitude 41.58, longitude 49.21. Heavy southwest swell has interfered with operations. 77 bodies recovered. All not embalmed will be buried at sea at 8 o'clock tonight with divine service. Can bring only embalmed bodies to port. To Captain Lardner, master of the Mackay Bennett, P.A.S. Franklin, vice president of the White Star Line, sent an urgent message asking that the company be advised at once of all particulars concerning the bodies identified, and also given any information that might lead to the identification of others. He said that it was very important that every effort be made to bring all of the bodies possible to port. Mr. Franklin then directed A. G. Jones, the Halifax agent of the White Star Line, to charter the Minia and send her to the assistance of the Mackay Bennett. Mr. Jones answered this telegram and said that the Minia was ready to proceed to sea, but that a southeast gale, which generally brings fog, might delay her departure. She left for Halifax. Names badly garbled. On April 24th, no wireless message was received from the Mackay Bennett, but the White Star Line officials and telegraphers familiar with the wireless alphabet were busy trying to reconcile some of the names received with those of persons who went down on the Titanic. That the body of William T. Stead, the English journalist and author, had been recovered by the Mackay Bennett, but through a freakish error in wireless transmission the name of another person was reported instead, was one of the theories advanced by persons familiar with the Morse code. Bremen cited more than 100 bodies. When the German liner Bremen reached New York, the account of its having sighted bodies of the Titanic victims was obtained. From the bridge, officers of the ship saw more than 100 bodies floating on the sea, a boat upside down, together with a number of small pieces of wood, steamer chairs, and other wreckage. As the cable ship Mackay Bennett was in sight, and having word that her mission was to look for bodies, no attempt was made by the Bremen's crew to pick up the corpses. In the vicinity was seen an iceberg which answered the description of the one the Titanic struck. Smaller bergs were sighted the same day, but at some distance from where the Titanic sank. The officers of the Bremen did not care to talk about the tragic spectacle, but among the passengers several were found who gave accounts of the dismal panorama through which their ship steamed. Mrs. Joanna Stunk, a first cabin passenger, described the scene from the liner's rail. "It was between 4 and 5 o'clock Saturday, April 20th, she said, when our ship sighted an iceberg off the bow to the starboard. As we drew nearer, we could make out small dots floating around in the sea. A feeling of awe and sadness crept over everyone on the ship. We passed within 100 feet of the southernmost drift of the wreckage, and looking down over the rail, we distinctly saw a number of bodies so clearly that we could make out what they were wearing, and whether they were men or women. We saw one woman in her night-dress, with a baby clasped closely to her breast. Several women passengers screamed and left the rail in a fainting condition. There was another woman, fully dressed, with her arms tight around the body of a shaggy dog. The bodies of 3 men in a group, all clinging to one steamship chair, floated nearby, and just beyond them were a dozen bodies of men, all of them encased in life-preservers, clinging together as though in a last desperate struggle for life. We couldn't see, but imagined that under them was some bit of wreckage to which they all clung when the ship went down, and which didn't have enough buoyancy to support them. Those were the only bodies we passed near enough to distinguish, but we could see the white life-preservers of many more dotting the sea all the way to the iceberg. The officers told us that was probably the berg hit by the Titanic, and that the bodies and ice had drifted along together." Mrs. Stunk said that a number of the passengers demanded that the Bremen stop and pick up the bodies, but the officers assured them that they had just received a wireless message saying the cable ship Mackay Bennett was only 2 hours away from the spot, and was coming for that express purpose. Other passengers corroborated Mrs. Stunk. The Mackay Bennett returns to port. After completing her search, the Mackay Bennett steamed for Halifax, reaching that port on Tuesday, April 30th. With her flag at half-mast, the death ship docked slowly. Her crew manned the rails with bared heads, and on the aft deck were stacked the caskets with the dead. The vessel carried on board 190 bodies, and announcement was made that 113 other bodies had been buried at sea. Every body picked up had been in a life belt, and there were no bullet holes in any. Among those brought to port were the bodies of 2 women. The Minia gives up the search. When at last the Minia turned her bow toward shore, only 13 additional bodies had been recovered, making a total of 316 bodies found by the 2 ships. Further search seemed futile. Not only had the 2 vessels gone thoroughly over as wide a field as might likely prove fruitful, But, in addition, the time elapsed made it improbable that the other bodies, if found, could be brought to shore. Thus did the waves completely enforce the payment of their terrible toll.